Wallach on Law examines criminal cases and criminal justice and asks the question, we are tough on crime, but is that helping? Can we be smarter and make us safer?
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Ian Wallach is a criminal defense attorney and civil rights lawyer in Los Angeles and New York. His cases have ranged from defense of the accused to the prosecution of governments in their treatment of convicts. He's a former Los Angeles deputy public defender and a frequent contributor on legal issues to radio and television shows nationwide.
You're out of order! You're out of order! The whole trial is out of order!
We're going to need a bigger post country. Our courts are the great levelers. In our courts, all men are created equal.
This is Wallach on Law. Here's your host, Ian Wallach.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us here on Wallach on Law. I'm your host, Ian Wallach, and today we're going to be talking about what happens when law enforcement officers come in contact with the mentally ill. Now, more than 1 out of every 4 people in the United States carries a diagnosable mental illness per some reports, but there's still a tremendous stigma associated with mental illness. And mental illness can make people act differently than other people do, and law enforcement officers are trained to look for things that are suspicious, to look for people who are acting differently than other people are. But rarely are they trained on how to identify or respond to someone who is mentally ill, despite how frequently they're called upon to do just that. And the combination of an officer who is not so trained and a mentally ill person can unfortunately be fatal. This year in Los Angeles, 2 veteran police officers saw a man named Ezell Ford walking on a sidewalk, and they stopped their patrol car and attempted to speak with him, but apparently he continued walking and made movements that these officers felt were suspicious, so they attempted to stop him. When the officers attempted to stop Mr. Ford, per reports by the Los Angeles Police Department, a struggle ensued, and they fell to the ground, and one of the officers believed that Mr. Ford was trying to get the officer's handgun from that officer's holster, and as a result, both officers repeatedly shot Mr. Ford and killed him. And a mere 3 months before that, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dontre Hamilton was asleep in Red Arrow Park across from City Hall. And employees of a coffee shop called the police to complain they didn't like that. Officers arrived and determined he was fine and left. But another officer came afterwards and woke Mr. Hamilton up with his baton. A struggle ensued, and that officer subsequently shot Mr. Hamilton 15 times with 14 bullets. There was 14 bullets in his gun. All went into Mr. Hamilton. One actually passed through Mr. Hamilton's hand and went into his body. Mr. Hamilton died almost immediately. Clearly, there's a problem. So let's talk to someone who's actually working on this issue to see what kind of solutions can be figured out and what needs to take place. And we are welcoming to the show today Ron Honberg. Now, Ron Honberg is the Director of Policy and Legal Affairs of NAMI. This is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And he's going to sort of help us understand the interaction that can take place between those who are afflicted with mental illness and law enforcement and some changes that might need to be made. Ron, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and I appreciate being on.
Hey, thank you. Now, first of all, can you let me know a little bit about NAMI, what its goals are, when it was organized, and how it's set up throughout the U.S.?
Sure. Well, as you said, NAMI stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and we've actually been in existence since 1979, very much a grassroots movement in that the first chapters were local affiliates, and then we created a national organization. We are the largest advocacy organization focused on mental illness in the country, and our members are primarily people with mental illness and their families. We have 1,100 affiliates. We're represented in every state. And again, our members and our members work on the education, trying to educate both the community and treatment providers about the realities of mental illness, advocacy. So they're represented in most of the state houses in the country and in local communities and at the national level through this office, and also support. They run support groups within their local communities.
And is the funding for NAMI, is there government funding? Is it primarily donor funded? Is it endowment funded?
It's we have multiple sources of funding. So we certainly get individual donations. We have some foundation grants for specific projects. We have some government funding, the national office, federal funding. Some of our state organizations have state funding, again for specific projects, and then we also get some corporate funding. Okay. So from healthcare organizations, pharmaceutical companies, etc. Our funding is quite diverse.
And if somebody wanted to, and I'm going to, of course, I'm going to come back to this as we wrap up our interview. But if someone wants to gather information about your organization, where could they go? Is it?
Okay, no, that's a great question. They can go to our website, which is www.nami.org, and that'll take them to our homepage and lots of information about what we do, and if they're interested in advocacy, for example, they can see what our advocacy priorities are. So we have a 1-800 helpline. We get thousands of calls per month, and it's staffed by multiple people, mostly volunteers, and that number is 1-800-950-6264, and those volunteers are pretty much prepared to answer just about any question that people have about mental illness, where to get help, etc.
And most of the calls, I imagine, that you get are people who are probably watching loved ones experience some form of a mental health crisis.
Yeah, or family members. And the sad reality is that, because there still is a real stigma and taboo surrounding mental illness, we don't talk about mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression in the same way we do about heart disease, cancer, diabetes. So
why do you think that is? That has always fascinated me. I mean, I can have, my work is primarily in criminal defense, and a large part of that is in indigent criminal defense, and mental health issues are unfortunately run rampant, in the indigent community. And this, when I tell people, hey, listen, why don't you go see a shrink? Why don't you go see a doctor? They look at me like I'm crazy, like I'm asking them to do something that's totally socially unaccepted. Why do you think we have the stigma associated with mental illness that we don't have associated with physical illness?
Well, I think part of it is the way mental illnesses have been portrayed in the media and elsewhere. There's oftentimes an association between mental illness and violence, at least in movies and TV shows, etc. Or when newspapers report on mental illness, it's usually in connection with some sort of violent or horrific tragedy that occurred, and so for someone with a mental illness who is not violent, there's this sort of natural inclination to want to not talk about the fact that they have a mental illness, to not acknowledge that they have a mental illness for fear that people will make certain judgments about them that don't in fact have a lot of bearing in reality, but nevertheless people will think that way. I also think that mental illnesses tend to scare people. The brain is a very, very complex organ of the body. It's the most complex organ of the body. And so, while we've made a lot of progress in understanding heart disease and in understanding the heart, understanding the pancreas, understanding the lungs, we have a long way to go, really, in understanding the workings of the brain. So it's a much more difficult thing to explain. It's difficult to explain what schizophrenia is. It's difficult to explain what someone experiences when they're in a psychotic episode. Of course, schizophrenia is characterized by delusions and hallucinations. People hear voices that to them seem as real as the day, but in fact aren't real. But how do you explain that to somebody who's not hearing those voices? And interestingly enough, and this is maybe just juxtaposing a little bit to the whole issue of training the police, one of the most effective devices or tools that have been used to train the police are actually devices that simulate hallucinations, where you put on a pair of headphones and you hear the kind of interference and voices that somebody's hearing when they're in an active psychotic episode. And
I'm sorry. This is a something that's used to train officers to try to understand the mental process.
Well, to train officers and to train others. I mean, that's the best way to for somebody like me to explain what an auditory hallucination is, to hear voices, is one thing, but to actually have that experience where you're actually hearing those voices, where you're going through a simulated scenario. You're going into a supermarket and the person behind the counter is talking to you, but you're hearing something else. You're hearing a lot of interference. That's interfering with your ability to concentrate, interfering with your ability to interact. To actually go through that simulation teaches people more and helps people understand much more effectively than some psychiatrist trying to explain.
That sounds incredibly valuable, and it also doesn't sound like it would be terribly expensive to implement.
It's not, and again, these tools have been used in a lot of. We've been very, very active around the country in working with police departments to try to train them on effective ways to respond to people in crisis. It's called CIT, Crisis Intervention Training Programs, and those tools, those devices that simulate hallucinations, if you will, are really an integral part of those.
And we've learned now that CIT training that can essentially be life-saving. Now, if you're just joining us now, this is Ian Wallach and Wallach on Law. Our guest is Ron Honberg. He's the Director of Policy and Legal Affairs at NAMI. And we were talking about CIT training, or as you referred to it as, I believe it's critical incident training?
No, it's actually crisis intervention training.
Crisis intervention training. I apologize.
Yes.
Okay.
That's okay.
And in the past several months, we've seen a series of absolutely horrific interactions, or the results of interactions between individuals who are afflicted with mental illness and law enforcement officers. We had an incident in Santa Barbara. We had the death of Ezell Ford here in Los Angeles. We had the death of Dontre Hamilton in Milwaukee. Each of these incidents shared the following component, which is someone who experiences mental illness and thinks differently and may, as a result, act differently than the norm, coming into contact with law enforcement officers and a resulting fatality. It is becoming a national problem. It's a quiet problem, potentially because of the stigma associated with mental illness, but a genuine problem nevertheless. What can we do to teach armed officers to be aware of and how to interact with individuals who may be going through psychotic episodes, or may just have a mental illness that makes them act slightly differently than other people would?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've become very appreciative over the years that police officers have the toughest job in the world. We ask them to deal with situations that most of us don't have to deal with in our day-to-day lives, and their jobs can be dangerous. Generally, I'm not speaking now necessarily about their interactions with people with mental illness, but generally. So police officers are trained to respond in a certain way in academy, and that's usually in a fairly aggressive way, to take charge of the situation, to squelch the situation before it escalates, to close in on people and repress the situation from escalating. That is probably for someone who is in the midst of a psychotic episode, is somebody with schizophrenia who is extremely paranoid and maybe having delusions that the FBI or the CIA are after them, and maybe homeless, maybe using drugs or alcohol as a form of self-medication. That kind of response is equivalent to pouring gasoline on a fire, feeds right into the person's fears and paranoia, and may precipitate an aggressive response on the part of the individual, not because they're necessarily inherently aggressive, but because they really believe that these people who are yelling at them, who are surrounding them, who are closing in on them, are a major threat to them. So what CIT programs, and the first CIT program started in Memphis, Tennessee, actually after about 2 or 3 real tragedies that occurred where the police got a lot of negative press, several lawsuits. The police made the commitment, really working with our local chapter and with the local mental health system, to try to do things in a different way. That was back in 1989. Today we have about 2,800 programs like these around the country. And these police are trained, first of all, on how to recognize the signs and symptoms, recognize when somebody's behaving in a certain way because they're in crisis. And then they're taught techniques for calming the person down, speaking quietly, keeping their distance, reassuring the person that they're there to help them, not to hurt them. And then, just as importantly, in these communities that are doing these programs, the mental health system is involved, so they create a triage center. It might be a psychiatric emergency room in the hospital, it might be a community mental health center, but it's a place where the police can take the person to, drop the person off, know the person is going to get help at that point, and the police can go back out and, do what they have to do, as opposed to what historically and traditionally has happened, which is the police have to take the person to the emergency room, sit there for hours and hours and hours, and then sometimes the next night see this same person back out in the streets doing the same thing they picked them up for the night before. That's one of the reasons why the police decide to arrest so many people, and why so many relatively low-level offenders with mental illness, nonviolent offenders, are in jail. It's because the police have no trust or faith in a lot of communities.
Do we have any type of have any studies been done, or are you aware of any type of empirical data as far as how efficient or beneficial these CIT training programs may actually be?
Well, certainly they have shown pretty dramatic results as far as reducing deaths and injuries on the part of the people the police are responding to. They've also, interestingly, shown positive results in terms of reducing injuries by the police themselves, because these are inherently unpredictable and sometimes dangerous situations for the police. They also show improvements in terms of the outcomes. So, decreases in the number of people the police decide to book and arrest and incarcerate, or take to local jail. That they don't ultimately decide if the person's going to be incarcerated. And interestingly enough, a lot of officers who've been through these training programs also say it helps them in their jobs generally, because, while it's specific to mental illness, these kind of tactics can work with other people who may be in crisis because of drug abuse or because of a difficult domestic situation or whatever.
Fascinating. If you're just joining us right now, this is Ian Wallach and Wallach on Law. Our guest is Ron Honberg. He's the Director of Policy and Legal Affairs at NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It also, I would imagine that, and I'm not trying to feed you a softball answer, but I probably am. I would imagine that the economic benefits to society for this type of training must be tremendous as well. It's probably infinitely better to interact safely with someone, or to get someone into a place where they can receive some type of mental health or medical treatment for an illness, than it would be to take someone, book them, incarcerate them, hold them, prosecute them for criminal conduct, etc.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, ultimately, it's less expensive to treat people and stabilize them and keep them stable than it is to arrest and incarcerate them, because for one thing, incarceration again usually does nothing because of the circumstances of incarceration. I mean, jails and prisons have been characterized as de facto mental health treatment facilities, but that's a misnomer, because most of them aren't set up at all to be provide effective treatment.
I want to add to that. The Department of Justice in May of this year issued a report that was related to the number of mentally ill inmate suicides at one particular prison in downtown Los Angeles. And
I know that. I'm very familiar with that report.
It's the Men's Central Jail, Twin Towers. And we actually we had Judge Smerling on to talk about how the program now to address that, which is to build a super jail with tons more beds. It makes no sense in light of spending that same amount of money on treatment centers. And yes, that jail is. I mean, I visit that jail on a regular basis. It is frightening, and it has been our de facto mental illness facility. And the Department of Justice actually said that the conditions were so bad that it increased rather than decreased the risk of suicide, which was just shocking.
Yeah, and I don't want to digress or take you away from what you want to talk about, but on the Twin Towers case, it's interesting. There is this discussion and somewhat of a disagreement taking place about whether the resources should be put into treating people in the community versus building a new jail that can more effectively provide treatment. And it's a little bit of a difficult issue for us because while we certainly would like to see as many people as possible be out in the community, and that's the goal here, jail diversion, there are some people who are inevitably going to be incarcerated, maybe some people who have been charged with more serious crimes, or people who have to at least remain in jail until a suitable treatment program is found to them. And we do want to make sure that while they're incarcerated, they receive humane treatment. So, it's not necessarily an either-or proposition, though I realize in a day and age of finite resources, hard decisions have to be made.
Now, if someone had someone close to them who was afflicted with a mental illness, and they wanted to try to help that person or try to help you, how could they reach out to you?
How could they reach out to NAMI?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have, as I said, affiliates pretty much throughout the country. So what we advise people to do is, when they contact us, we usually try to put them in touch with our local affiliate because our people at the local level are the one, these are, again, mostly families of people with mental illnesses or people with mental illnesses themselves. So they know the local system. They know how it works or doesn't work. They know who the key players are. Plus, they may run a support group. And so, for a family, for example, it can be tremendously beneficial to go to a support group and just meet other families who are going through similar things. Or to be educated, we assume psychiatrists will educate family members or people who have these illnesses themselves about what the illnesses are. I mean, if you're being treated for cancer, usually your doctor will educate you about what it means and what the prospects are and what the risks and benefits of the medications are. We're improving in psychiatry, but we still have a long way to go. So it's really important, I think, to get hooked up with a support system locally and to meet other people who have walked the walk, so to speak. There's a growing peer support movement in the mental health field. People who have been diagnosed themselves, but who have achieved a level of recovery and who are devoted to sort of helping others, negotiate those same challenges. So again, getting involved at the local level is really key. But as I mentioned earlier, if they want to contact us, we can certainly put them in touch with the local group, and that's through our website, www.nami.org, or through our helpline, which is, I gave the number earlier, 1-800-950-6264.
Now, I also know, and one thing that I was so impressed with is I did come in contact with a family who had lost someone in relation to an officer-related shooting. And they connected with the NAMI office in Milwaukee, and were absolutely embraced in such a surprising and warm way. And it seems like a place where people who've been dealing with this thing, which does have a stigma, which we hopefully one day can be able to overcome, can go to find support in a variety of ways. Support socially, support as far as obtaining psychological services. I mean, it seems like there's generally incredibly good people who are volunteering at NAMI offices throughout the country.
Well, definitely true, and I'm always happy to hear stories like the one you just told. And the other thing that's important for your listeners to be aware of is that mental illness. There's a perception that if you're diagnosed with a serious mental illness, your life is over. Your life is going to be one of misery. And again, that's how mental illness is frequently portrayed. But the reality is that recovery for a lot of people is very possible. There are treatments that work. People do. I've met thousands and thousands of people over the years who have overcome the symptoms of their illnesses. While they still might experience them, they're informed consumers. They know how to deal with them. They know maybe when their medication needs to be adjusted, or whatever, and they really recover to the point that they can live productive, meaningful lives, have jobs, live independently, marry, etc. It doesn't mean it's not a life sentence to misery anymore, and that's something that's another reason why it's so important to get involved in a support system.
Let me ask you, in closing, we only have about 2 minutes left, and again, if you're joining us, this is Wallach on Law. We're speaking with Ron Honberg of NAMI. In the Milwaukee incident, in the incident out here, the officer did not have CIT training. It seems to be, and you even mentioned some of the additional benefits of CIT training as far as how it can not only help officers in dealing with individuals who suffer from mental illness, but in dealing with individuals who are going through any situation which is sort of expressing a psychological strain. What could a listener do if they wanted more law enforcement officers to undergo this training that seems to be so beneficial?
Well, my answer is pretty much going to be the same one as I gave you earlier. I think getting involved with a group that does political and policy advocacy at the local level is really important. So in order to get a CIT program developed that's really going to work, you need to get all the key players on board. The police chief needs to support it. The director of the local mental health agency needs to support it. Oftentimes, you need to get judges involved and in support of it. And in order to do that, relationships are all local. We know that, right? So in communities, you get a group of like-minded advocates together. They utilize their contacts. They utilize the political process, their relationships, etc., to effectuate change, and all it really takes is one sort of key local leader who believes in it to make things happen and to turn things around.
And you guys have set this up.
And the other thing is that you have to. I'm sorry.
No, you guys have set this. Now you said that there's how many of these programs that are put together?
There are 2,800 and growing all the time.
That is
but
fantastic.
let me put that in context. There's still far more communities that don't have it than do.
Sure.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, for people who may be interested in seeing which communities have it and which don't, the University of Memphis actually maintains the CIT Center at the University of Memphis. Remember, the first CIT program started in Memphis. They actually have a website that lists all the programs. CIT is www.cit.memphis.edu. And that will take you right to the CIT Center, and there is a great map on there that a person can click around on and see if their community has a CIT program.
And I guess people are going to be able to draw some pretty powerful conclusions by when these more tragic incidents occur, to see if such programs are in place where these incidents happen.
Right. And of course, once you create one of these programs, you also have to sustain it. That's also important. We've seen a lot of communities start them, and then the chief changes, and the key players move on, and then all of a sudden, it lapses. And so sustaining, like any other great program, you have to sustain it.
Ron, thank you so much for not only for what you do and for your education and for your combating against the stigma, also for this work that NAMI is doing in promoting first responder training. It's actually clearly going to save lives. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, Ian, thank you for having me and for doing a show on this important topic.
Absolutely, my pleasure. If you want to know more about NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, you can go to www.nami.org. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up this week's edition of Wallach on Law, but I want to leave you with some closing thoughts. First, this is a real issue. Okay, I presently have 2 cases right now involving officers who shot individuals who were mentally ill. One resulted in a fatality, the other fortunately didn't. But these individuals, there was no evidence of separate criminal conduct. They weren't doing anything other than just suffering from their illness when this happened. It's a real problem. And second, when an officer kills someone who's mentally ill, it doesn't necessarily mean that officer is evil or cruel. cruel. It just means that we, as a society, need to provide some form of better training. One of the downsides to any officer-involved shooting is there becomes this distrust of law enforcement officers in general, and that's simply just unfair, unwise. It doesn't get us anywhere. Most officers are out there doing what they're doing because they believe that they're keeping society safe, and we need them to keep our society safe. So we have to find some solution to make this interaction safer pretty much for everyone. And lastly, these people who suffer from mental illness, these are our brothers, these are our sisters, these are our friends and our family. So on our next episode of Wallach on Law, we're going to be speaking with the family of Dontre Hamilton, who was killed in Red Arrow Park, and they're going to tell you how they are living with his dying. Now, if you have some thoughts you want to share, please send them to me at change@renovatejustice.com. And renovatejustice.com, that's my blog on criminal justice reform. And you can also reach me at wallachlegal.com. Special thanks to my producers, Ryan McCormick and Mark Goldman in New York, and to Ron Honberg of NAMI for spending his time here. And thanks to you for listening, because for listening and speaking, we might actually get to do some fixing. Until next time, let's keep using our heads, let's stop using our hate, and let's talk soon.